Good evening. I was so excited when I got the invitation to speak tonight, and I got such cold feet when I realized actually what the title of the conference was, Talking Taboos. I am many things, but I'm not a taboo breaker. But actually there is one taboo I broke it was quite a while ago when I was younger. When I got married, my wife's last name, her family name, became my last name or surname. So I changed from Thomas Scholl to Thomas Ihde. It was unusual at the time. It was my very, very, very significant contribution to more gender equality, or so at least I thought at the time. It was a small step for me, but it turned out to be a huge and impossible step for my parents, who come from a very traditional small village in rural Switzerland. They did not talk to me for quite some time, even though we actually were very close. Now, what I broke is a small taboo, and what I want to talk to you about today also is a small taboo, or so one would think. Mental health, we call it now. I like the term. It's positive. We all have it, a mental health. To find out what's actually taboo about it, you need to look at the term that's kind of lurking around the corner from mental health, and that is mental illness. Now, I know a lot of you will think now, well, we've been talking a lot more about mental health these last few years. Yeah, we have been talking, for example, about mindfulness. Mindfulness is everywhere. You can even buy mindfulness tea now or mindfulness bath salts. They'll cost you 19 francs 50. It's a 7 franc surcharge for mindfulness. But don't get me wrong, mindfulness is a great thing, but it's also a comfortable thing. Now with the pandemic, we've also been talking about a few things that might be maybe less comfortable. There's a general understanding that with the pandemic, our mental health has been affected. Maybe we've been worrying more. Maybe we felt lonely. Maybe we've been isolated. Maybe even we've felt depressed. We are still in the realm, though, of maybe things that are less comfortable. What I want to talk to you, though, about today might be in the realm of maybe a little uncomfortable. Let me give you 2 examples. Oh, what a day at work. My coworker, he kept having panic attacks. I just didn't know what to do. I felt so overwhelmed. Somehow, though, we made it both kind of through it. But he's such a nice guy. Now, are you there in the realm of comfortable, a little bit less comfortable, or maybe somewhat uncomfortable? Another scene. Did you know that our pastor has schizophrenia? Our daughter knew all about it. Are you here in the realm of comfortable, maybe a little less comfortable, or maybe in the realm of uncomfortable? Now, governments, health agencies, or charities like Promentesana, the Swiss mental health charity that I represent, have been working hard to address this taboo. It's turned out to be actually quite difficult. We've learned, though, that there are 3 things you need to address when you want to reduce that taboo of mental illness. I'll use a program called ENSA to illustrate those 3 things. ENSA is a first aid course not for physical health. ENSA is a first aid course for mental health. Now let's look at those 3 things. The first thing, imagine I suddenly now grab my chest. I look like I'm in severe pain. I fall down to my knees. I think most of you would figure he's having a heart attack, and I would hope that all of you would know what to do. Now, do you have the same kind of knowledge when it comes to a mental illness? Would you know or would you recognize panic disorder? Would you know what the signs and symptoms of a mania are? Would you know what the signs and symptoms of schizophrenia are? Now, I see some of you nodding with your head. I see that you're thinking, yeah, I know what schizophrenia is. It is split personality. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It is not Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. My name is Mr. Ihde. And it is not, that's the bigger problem, split personality. When it comes to mental illnesses, we actually all have very limited knowledges. In a way, we mostly are analphabets when it comes to mental illness. Now, ENSA addresses that. It gives you a lot of facts. It teaches you the signs of symptoms of the major mental illnesses like depression, anxiety disorders, but also schizophrenia or suicidal ideations. People love that kind of knowledge, but knowledge is a head thing. So factor number one that you need to address is the knowledge thing, the head thing. For factor number two, we have to go back to the story that I shared you in the beginning with my coworker with the panic attacks. Now, would you know how to help someone with panic attacks? Now, when you look at that, again, ENSA will teach you a lot of things. It will teach you the steps that you need to take to approach that person. It will teach you the skills you need to help someone. A recent study in Switzerland actually looked at that. The study is quite clear. 90% of all Swiss could immediately name someone in their immediate surrounding that had a mental health problem. 20% felt comfortable enough and confident enough to take steps towards that person to offer help. 20%. So ENSA again teaches you those steps and those skills. It uses an acronym called ROGER. So it teaches you how to respond. It teaches you how to offer a non-judgmental ear. It teaches you to give support. It teaches you to encourage appropriate help. And it teaches you to connect to more resources. ROGER. Now, are these steps very technical, medical, or even psychiatric? No, they're actually very human. It is about showing interest. It is about showing compassion, things that we all can learn. So factor number one, knowledge, is the head thing. Factor number two is learning to take steps and learn skills to help someone. Factor number two is about finding the courage to make a step towards someone to offer help. Knowledge is the head thing, courage is the heart thing. Now, what about factor number three? For that, we'll go back to that other scene I described. Now, did you hear that our pastor has schizophrenia? Our daughter, she knew all about it. Now, for most of us, we hear two words, pastor, schizophrenia. And for most of us, these two terms don't really connect. There is a mismatch between the two. Now, if you actually talk to the people in that community, they would tell you a lot of things about this pastor. They would say, oh, he's a wonderful man. He's such a great pastor. He's a good speaker. His sermons are really interesting. But he's really good at pastoral care. He's so good at listening to people and comforting people who are in distress, who might have lost a loved one. He's also interesting to talk to. He's traveled the world. He speaks fluently Russian. He's a good chess player. And he has several dogs. And yeah, he has schizophrenia. It sometimes still shows. So they will show you very different aspects, very different facets about this pastor. Maybe 20 different one of which being schizophrenia. The minute, though, one of these facets actually turns out to be a major mental illness like schizophrenia, all the other 19 disappear. And when one facet that's viewed negatively by society overpowers everything else, we talk about stigmatization or stigma. Now, some of you might think, well, with the kind of what has happened in the last few years, stigma, it's kind of, going out the back door, luckily. I wish that was true. If you look at studies that looked at the tendency for the last 30 years for an illness like anorexia, an illness like bipolar disorder, an illness like borderline personality disorder, or schizophrenia, stigma has not decreased. Stigma has actually increased. And it has not increased by 2%. It has not increased by 7%. It actually has increased by 18% over the course of 30 years in a country like Sweden. So stigma turns out to be actually still the major roadblock when it comes to the taboo of mental illness. Because it is so important, we'll look at it a little bit more in detail. So we're looking at 3 factors: the head thing, the heart thing, and now that third thing. And with the third thing, I'll talk about 3 things again. I think you start to figure out what my favorite number is. It is 7, by the way. The first thing, when you want to measure stigma, you actually measure how much social closeness or how much social distance would people like to a person with a mental illness. So would you carpool with someone who self-harms? Would you have a roommate that has or is autistic? Would you share your office with someone who has severe OCD? Would you be okay marrying someone who has bulimia? The second thing you look at with stigma is whether people are willing to self-disclose. So if you had a mental illness, would you feel okay sharing that with your teammates in the volleyball team? Would you be okay with sharing that with relatives that you haven't seen in a year? Would you be okay with sharing that with your teenage children that might share it with all their friends? Would you be okay with sharing that with your coworkers? Or would you be okay with sharing that with your boss? Now, studies in Switzerland actually show that 30% of us feel comfortable sharing that kind of information with our boss. 30%. United Kingdom, much, much more progressive. That number is only 50%, not that different after all. If you look at the third thing, when it comes to stigma, we're talking about something that's called internalized stigma. So stigma is what other people think about us because of our mental health problem, meaning that they most likely are going to judge us for the mental health problem. It really is, though, about our assumption, what we think, what other people think about us because of the mental health problem. Australian studies show that we actually overestimate that level of stigma. And that has to do with the internalized stigma. Because stigma really is about what we think about ourselves because of the mental health problem. And we are our harshest critics. We are the ones who think that it is not an illness, it is a character flaw, a personality issue, that we just need to work harder, just pull ourselves together, even though that hasn't worked for 7 years. So stigma is a very important thing, and stigma is also the main thing where NSA works. How does it do that? I told you, first thing is NSA gives you knowledge, and knowledge is the head thing. It gives you the courage to make a step forward, the heart thing. And stigma is a gut thing. Stigma is instinct. And if you want to change instinct, you have to work with direct experience. Now, when you take an NSA course, you have to do a lot of role-playing, and I know everybody loves role-play. I'm the first person to fade into any background like the chameleon the second a volunteer is needed to role-play. But when you actually have to role-play someone who might be severely depressed, when you have to play someone that is suicidal, when you have to play someone who has schizophrenia, you are walking in their shoes. And you realize that their shoes are not very different from your own shoes. Common humanity. And it's walking in those shoes that changes your gut. It's walking in those shoes that changes instincts. And it's walking in those shoes that decreases stigma. Now remember that little story I started out with my name change and my parents? Well, 27 years after my marriage, I was asked to give a talk in the village where my parents live with all their friends there. Now, giving a TED talk makes you kind of nervous, but it's nothing compared to giving a talk in front of your parents and all their best friends and the entire village there. Now, 3 things happened there. My favorite number still is 7, but 3 things happened. First, during the introduction, I suddenly realized that my parents had kept my name change a secret in the entire village for all these years. My parents realized that there was this one facet, the name change, but all their friends talked about 19 other facets of me, in luckily quite a positive way. My parents realized, though, too, that though that facet, the name change, they did not like, it was about breaking out of the mold. And that facet was connected to other qualities I have, where I was also breaking the mold, and that's what their friends responded to. When it comes to mental illness, it's kind of a similar thing. Most people would also say it's not their most favorite facet about themselves. Most people also realize, though, there is a connection between that facet and positive facets in their life. The pastor, why is he so compassionate? Why is he such a good listener? It's because of his lived experience of having schizophrenia. Now, if my parents were here tonight, they would have one final piece of advice for you. Don't wait 27 years. Thank you.